This week marks 100 years since Nelson Mandela's birth. The longtime prisoner under apartheid and later president of South Africa was a giant of the 20th century, a man who led his country to a new democratic future. He set a political and a moral example recognized around the globe. Mandela stepped down from office in 1999, and he died in 2013 at the age of 95. Jeffrey Brown has more on a new book that offers insight into Mandela's remarkable story.
Nelson Mandela told much of his own story in the 1994 memoir, Long Walk to Freedom. A follow-up volume was published just last year. Now comes a different look at the man, again in his own words, the prison letters of Nelson Mandela. 255 letters written over the more than 27 years he spent as a political prisoner, from 1962 to 1990. My colleague Charlene Hunter-Gault was there the day Mandela was released and covered him and the epoch-making events in South Africa in the years that followed, and joins me now. And it's, first of all, nice to see you again.
Nice to be here again.
You know, what emerges from these letters that we perhaps didn't know, this man who was both private and public?
Actually, Jeff, I think that we get into the interior man, some of the pain that he went through, some of the principles that he continued to stand for, no matter the terrible conditions under which he and his fellow prisoners lived. And then the love of his family, starting with Winnie and his children and the larger family. So it's things we'd never heard before.
Let's start with that part. We've pulled some excerpts from some of these letters, and I want to start with one that is very personal. This is from after he got a photo from Winnie.
April 2nd, 1969. All that I wish to say now is that the picture has aroused all the tender feelings in me and softened the grimness that is all around. It's sharpened my longing for you in our sweet and peaceful home. All these have come back again as I examine the portrait.
So the grimness, but also the tender feeling.
It is so clear throughout that his love for Winnie was undiminished, and his caring for her and the children in ways that you didn't see, particularly in Long Walk to Freedom. These are very intimate moments when he's writing to her. You
talked to him in 1990, and I want to show a little video excerpt of that where he's talking about how he coped with that.
We decided to fight back right from the beginning. Nobody would order us to run. We refused to do that. And we said that the warders must stick to regulations and would not do anything outside the regulation.
Now this goes to this the resistance that he and other prisoners, their acts of resistance while in prison. That comes through in the letters too. There's another excerpt that I want us to listen to now, which goes to that.
July 12th, 1976. It's futile to think that any form of persecution will ever change our views. Your government and department have a notorious reputation for their hatred, contempt, and persecution of the black man.
That was from a letter to the Minister of Justice, keeping up the resistance.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you know, what was amazing was that he would write these long letters to the Minister of Justice, to the head of the prisons, and it would be very legalistic almost because, you know, he had studied to become a lawyer, although it took many years in prison for him to finally earn his degree. But he would write these long letters that were legalistic, but at the same time they were impassioned about the things that he was complaining about. Like he demanded that the prisoners be released and that they stop being treated in terrible ways that they were. One man was once put into a hole and you could only see his head up like this now, and Mandela was often put in solitary confinement himself, but he let the prison authorities know that their heads were in effect bloody but unbowed in terms of why they were there.
There is that strength, but also coming through as a kind of painful powerlessness, right, of having to deal with, of not being able to be there.
Well, sure, because this comes out, again, most forcefully and poignantly when he was not able to go to his mother's funeral. And he talked from his heart about how pained he was that they would not allow him to go.
We have another excerpt I want to listen to, which is, again, to Winnie. as she was about to go on trial.
November 16th, 1969. You're engaged in a contest with an adversary who possesses vast resources in wealth and means of propaganda, and who will be able to give facts any twist he considers expedient.
So here he is offering advice, prisoner to prisoner, in a sense.
Well, he was actually demanding that he be allowed to come and help represent her.
And to her and to everyone else, the eye on the goal never wavered, right? This future that he envisioned.
What's amazing is that what I found amazing about the letters is that from time to time he would talk about when I see you or when we get together again. And I asked Max Sisulu, who's the son of one of the prisoners with Mandela, Walter Sisulu, was he just psyching himself or did he really think he would get out? And he said, look, those guys focused on their vision of the future and they were prepared to die. And so this helped to keep the vision alive. It wasn't that he thought he might get out, but his vision for the country was something that kept him going.
Here's one more excerpt that goes to that.
August 1st, 1970. One day we may have on our side the genuine and firm support of an upright and straightforward man holding high office who will consider it improper to shirk his duty of protecting the rights and privileges of even his bitter opponents in the battle of ideas that is being fought in our country today.
So he's saying one day we may have such a man, and he turned out to be, of course, that man.
Well, you know, it's hard to know whether he thought he would ever be, but he certainly laid down the principles that he believed in as a person who was fighting for a free South Africa. I mean, he talked about how he visualized a world where there'd be no famine, no war, no racism.
You know, we think about this long arc. He was, of course, released. He became the president of a democratic South Africa. You and I have talked about this. I was there just last year looking at that legacy. And that legacy by a younger generation is still questioned, right? How much change has there really been? How much change did he and his generation really affect?
Well, I've heard that the younger generation are, you know, complaining about what he did and didn't do. And it reminds me of a point in the book where he talks about how a younger group of prisoners were brought in after these older guys had been there for a while, and they were all up in the air about how come you didn't do this and why aren't you doing this? And he eventually won them over. And I'm sure that someone with the principles of Nelson Mandela and the commitment today could address some of the lingering problems in the country.
Because they do exist.
They exist, and as Martin Luther King often said, and I'm sure Mandela believed this, the arc of the moral universe is long and involves a lot of struggle. But in the end, it bends towards justice.
All right, the new collection is The Prison Letters of Nelson Mandela. Charlayne Hunter-Gault, nice to talk to you.
Jeff, it's great being with you.
Great to be looking at Mandela through the eyes of Charlayne Hunter-Gault.